Hi, my name's Sophia. My own brother, a corporate executive, mocked my worthless career in front of our entire family at Thanksgiving dinner. He smirked when I said, "You have no idea what I actually do." He thought I was just some struggling government employee with a dead-end job. He didn't know who I commanded. 20 minutes later, his boss walked in, saluted me and said, "Good evening, General." And in that silence, his smugness shattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I settled into my parents' living room, the familiar scent of sage and rosemary wafting from the kitchen. Mom still used Grandma's stuffing recipe, the one that filled the house with warmth hours before the turkey was done. The couch cushions were worn in just the right spots, shaped by years of holiday gatherings and family movie nights. I ran my fingers along the arm of the sofa, tracing the small tear that had been there since my brother Marcus and I fought over the remote when we were teenagers. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, sending crimson and gold leaves dancing across the front yard. Inside, it was all cinnamon candles, football game commentary from Dad's ancient TV, and the gentle hum of Mom's favorite Thanksgiving playlist drifting from the kitchen. The house hadn't changed much in 20 years, but everything else had. Thanksgivings used to mean something different. 10 years ago, Marcus and I would help Mom cook, stealing bites of mashed potatoes when she wasn't looking, elbowing each other at the sink as we washed dishes. He'd tell terrible jokes that somehow still made me laugh, and I'd pretend to be annoyed when he ruffled my hair like I was still 12. That was before our paths diverged, before his corporate climb and my military career, before the divide grew so wide we barely recognized each other. I pressed my palm against the family photo on the side table, our smiles frozen in a moment when we still understood each other. When we were kids, we made a pact that we'd always have each other's backs. One night during a thunderstorm, huddled under a blanket fort in the living room, he promised he'd always protect me. That was back when I believed blood meant unconditional support. After I joined the military, his calls became less frequent. At first, I thought distance had created a natural gap. But then came the comments, subtle at first, then increasingly biting, criticizing my career choice, questioning my ambition, suggesting I'd chosen the easy path while he conquered the corporate world at Westridge Financial. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. I felt the shift in the air before I heard his voice. Marcus walked in with his designer overcoat, Italian leather briefcase, flanked by his wife Vanessa in her cashmere sweater dress and pearls. He didn't scan the room for me. He knew exactly where I'd be. I raised my hand, half a wave, not a full one. He returned it with a curt nod, walking straight past Dad, past Mom, who emerged from the kitchen with flour-dusted hands and a smile that tried too hard. She glanced between us like she was bracing for impact. "Everything okay?" she whispered when she hugged me. I nodded and smiled reassuringly. Not yet. Marcus's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, confident and measured. He stopped by the drinks cart Dad had set up, pouring himself a generous glass of the expensive scotch he'd brought. "So," he said, voice carrying across the room without him having to try. "How's the government work treating you, Soph? Still pushing papers at that desk job?" The room seemed to contract around his words. Mom busied herself rearranging the appetizer tray. Dad cleared his throat and turned up the volume on the football game. Vanessa examined her manicure with sudden interest. "It's going well," I replied evenly, keeping my voice steady despite the familiar twist in my stomach. "My department just completed a major project." He took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal. "That's nice. Must be fulfilling to finally finish all that filing." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Westridge just closed the Miller acquisition. $2.3 billion. Richard's putting me up for senior VP after this quarter." I nodded, not taking the bait. "Congratulations. You know," he continued, settling into Dad's armchair like it was a throne, "they're always looking for admin support staff. I could put in a word. The benefits are better than government work, and you'd finally have a career with some upward mobility." Mom appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dinner's ready, everyone." Her voice was too bright, too forced. She'd been orchestrating these ceasefires for years. Around the table, the conversation flowed around me. Marcus dominated, of course, talking about market predictions, his new vacation home in Aspen, the private school they'd chosen for my niece. I listened, nodded at appropriate moments, passed dishes when asked. The turkey was perfectly cooked. The cranberry sauce had just the right tartness. The gravy was smooth and rich. Mom had outdone herself, as always. So Sophia, Vanessa said during a lull, her voice honey-sweet but eyes calculating. Are you still living in that tiny apartment near the base? Before I could answer, Marcus chimed in. You know, sis, at your age, you should be building equity. Real estate is the foundation of wealth building, but I guess government salaries don't exactly set you up for investment opportunities. I took a slow sip of water, feeling the cool glass against my lips. My housing situation works for my needs. Your needs could be higher, he countered, cutting into his turkey with surgical precision. That's always been your problem, Soph. Low expectation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus, your sister has done very well for herself. Sure, Dad, Marcus said with a dismissive wave. I'm just saying there's a difference between settling and succeeding. He turned back to me. Remember when we were kids, and you said you wanted to change the world? Now you're what, a government clerk? Processing forms for veterans' benefits or whatever it is you do. The room grew still. Mom's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Dad's jaw tightened. Vanessa glanced between us, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. I serve my country, I said simply. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. Come on, Soph. Let's not dress it up. You file paperwork for the Department of Defense. It's not exactly frontline service. He turned to our parent. Did she tell you she turned down the position I found for her at Westridge last year? Executive assistant to the CFO. Would have doubled her salary. I already have a job, I replied, maintaining eye contact, despite the heat rising in my cheeks. A job, he repeated, emphasizing the word like it was somehow less than a career. That's exactly my point. You've always settled for jobs when you could have built a career. Remember your art phase, your teaching ambitions. Now it's government work. You drift from one thing to another without committing to excellence in any of them. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket but ignored it. This wasn't the time. Some of us measure success differently, Marcus. He scoffed. Success has objective metrics, Sophia. Salary, title, influence, assets. He gestured around him, as if the very air he occupied was worth more than mine. By any measurable standard, pushing papers at a government desk doesn't exactly scream achievement. Mom stood abruptly. Who's ready for dessert? I made your favorite pumpkin pie, Marcus, and apple for you, Sophia. But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on mine. You know what your problem is? You've never had the stomach for real competition. The military was just another way to hide in a system with predetermined ranks and clear rules. The real world, my world, requires more than just following orders and filling out forms. My phone buzzed again. This time I glanced down. 2 missed calls and a text. Urgent, Silver Eagle situation developing. Awaiting your command. ETA to your location 20 minutes. I looked up to find Marcus watching me, a satisfied smirk on his face. Important paperwork emergency? Something like that, I replied, sliding my phone back into my pocket. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about, he continued, warming to his theme. No ambition, no drive. If you'd applied yourself like I did, Marcus, Dad interrupted, his voice firm. That's enough. No, Dad. She needs to hear this. Someone has to be honest with her. He turned back to me. You're wasting your potential in some dead-end government job because you're afraid to compete in the real world. You think I don't know what you did? Pushing papers, following protocols, collecting a mediocre paycheck while people like me drive the economy forward. The familiar pressure built behind my eyes, not tears but the calm, focused clarity that came before making critical decisions. The same feeling I'd had in Kandahar when our convoy was ambushed, in Mosul when the diplomatic compound was breached, in Washington when the Joint Chiefs needed a decision in 3 minutes that would affect operations across the globe. You have no idea what I do, I said quietly. He leaned back, crossing his arms. I know enough. You've been at the same pay grade for what, 5 years? Still Still Lieutenant Sophia Miller, pushing papers at the Pentagon while real leaders make real decisions. The doorbell rang. Mom looked relieved at the interruption, quickly standing. That must be Richard. He said he might stop by for dessert. Marcus straightened immediately, smoothing his already perfect tie. Richard Harrington was the CEO of Westridge Financial, his direct boss, the man who held the keys to the senior VP position he coveted. "Why didn't you tell me Richard was coming?" he hissed at Vanessa, who looked equally surprised. "I didn't know," she whispered back, quickly checking her reflection in her phone camera. I remained seated, taking another bite of turkey as the front door opened and voices drifted in from the hallway. Mom's warm welcome, Dad's deeper greeting, and then a familiar baritone that made me smile into my napkin. Richard Harrington walked into the dining room, his imposing 6'3" frame filling the doorway. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, despite the holiday, with keen eyes that missed nothing. Behind him stood Colonel James Peterson, my chief of staff, in his dress uniform, ramrod straight with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Marcus was on his feet instantly, hand extended. "Richard, what a pleasant surprise. We were just discussing the Miller acquisition." But Richard wasn't looking at Marcus. His eyes had found me, still seated at the table. Without hesitation, he straightened to attention and offered a crisp, formal salute. "Good evening, General Miller," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military service before his corporate career. "I apologize for the interruption, but matters require your immediate attention." The room went completely still. Marcus's extended hand hung in the air, forgot. Vanessa's mouth formed a perfect O-wisp of surprise. Mom and Dad exchanged knowing glances. I stood, straightening my posture automatically, years of training taking over. "At ease, Colonel Peterson." I nodded to my chief of staff, who remained at attention. "I take it this is about Silver Eagle." "Yes, ma'am," Colonel Peterson replied, stepping forward to hand me the portfolio. "The situation has escalated. Secretary Davis has requested your immediate video conference. We've set up secure communications in the car." I opened the portfolio, quickly scanning the top document, my mind already shifting gears, analyzing parameters, considering contingency. Richard Harrington, who had served as a colonel under my command during my second Middle East deployment, before retiring to the corporate world, stood respectfully silent. Marcus stared at me, then at Richard, then back at me. His face had drained of all color, the realization dawning slowly across his features. "General," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I closed the portfolio. "Brigadier General Sophia Miller, United States Army, Joint Special Operations Command." I didn't add the rest of my credentials. They weren't relevant to the moment, and time was critical. "I don't understand," Marcus stammered. "You said you worked for the Department of Defense." "I do," I replied simply. Richard turned to Marcus, his expression professionally neutral, but with a hint of something harder underneath. "Your sister is one of the most respected strategic minds in the military. I served under her command in Qatar. The operation she led saved thousands of lives, including mine." He turned back to me. "It's an honor to see you again, General, though I wish it were under different circumstances." Colonel Peterson checked his watch. "Ma'am, we need to depart in 5 minutes to make the secure call." I nodded. "Thank you, Colonel." I turned to my parents, who looked concerned but not surprised. They'd known, of course. They'd always known, respecting my need for discretion. "I'm sorry to cut dinner short. Duty calls." Mom came around the table and hugged me tightly. "Be safe," she whispered. Dad squeezed my shoulder, his eyes saying everything his voice didn't need. As I gathered my things, Marcus remained frozen, his expression shifting between shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like shame. Vanessa kept glancing between me and Richard, recalculating something in her mind. I paused beside my brother. "Marcus," I said quietly, "not all important work happens in boardroom, and not all success can be measured in dollars." I kept my voice gentle. Despite everything, he was still my brother. I never needed you to understand my choices. I just needed you to respect. Richard cleared his throat. "Marcus, I'd like a word with you at the office." on Monday regarding the Miller acquisition analysis. There are discrepancies in the projections that need addressing. The color that had drained from Marcus's face didn't return. If anything, he went paler. He nodded stiffly, professional instinct taking over even as his personal worldview crumbled. I walked to the door, Colonel Peterson and Richard flanking me. Outside, an unmarked black SUV waited. Engine running, 2 military police standing at attention beside it. A second car idled behind it for Richard's return to the city. As the cool night air hit my face, I heard footsteps behind me. Marcus had followed us out, his expression lost, like a man who had suddenly discovered the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd believed. "Sophia," he called, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. I didn't know. I turned back, the wind catching my hair. "You never asked." Behind him, through the front window, I could see Mom and Dad watching, concern and pride mingled on their faces. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders, not just for the operation awaiting my command, but for the broken bridge between my brother and me. "We'll talk when I get back," I said, not unkindly. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Marcus. Maybe it's time you learned." Colonel Peterson opened the SUV door. "General, we need to move now." I nodded and stepped toward the vehicle. Behind me, Richard spoke quietly to Marcus. Something about perspective and assumptions. I didn't listen. My mind was already shifting to the crisis at hand, to the decisions that would need to be made, to the men and women who relied on my judgment. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, I glanced back at my childhood home. Marcus stood on the front step, looking smaller somehow in his expensive suit, watching as the car disappeared into the night. In the glow of the porch light, I could see his expression, the familiar features of the brother who once promised to protect me, now realizing I had spent my career protecting him, and everything he took for granted. The weight of command was familiar, a mantle I had worn for years. But as we drove toward the secure facility, I found myself thinking not of the crisis awaiting my attention, but of Thanksgiving dinners past and future, and whether some bridges once revealed might finally be ready for repair. Colonel Peterson handed me a secure tablet. "The situation brief, ma'am. Secretary Davis and the Joint Chiefs will be online in 15 minutes. I took the tablet, my fingers already swiping through the intelligence reports, satellite imagery and operational assessments. This was my world, clear, focused, consequential. A world where titles were earned through action, not claimed through ambition. A world Marcus had never bothered to understand. "Thank you, Colonel," I said, settling into the work that had defined my life, the work that had never been about pushing papers, but about pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions, and making decisions that mattered. Just like the decision I would eventually have to make about my brother, and whether understanding could grow in the space where judgment once flourished. The secure line crackled with static before the Secretary of Defense's face appeared on the screen. Behind him, the familiar backdrop of the Pentagon's secure communications room, a space I knew well from countless other crisis moments. The SUV hummed beneath me, a cocoon of technology and security slicing through the darkened suburban streets. "General Miller," Secretary Davis nodded, his expression grave. "Sorry to pull you from your family dinner." "Duty first, sir," I replied, the words automatic after 20 years of service. "We have a situation in the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian Revolutionary Guard vessels have intercepted a commercial tanker carrying American crew members. Initial intelligence suggests they're being held on board. The White House needs options in 30 minutes. Colonel Peterson handed me a secure tablet with the latest satellite imagery. I studied it, mind already mapping contingencies, calculating risks, weighing variables that would determine whether American service members would live or die. This was my actual job, not pushing papers, not following protocol, but making the hard calls when lives hung in the balance. "I'll have 3 scenarios prepared in 20, Mr. Secretary. Has CENTCOM been notified?" "Standing by for your assessment, General." The call continued for another 10 minutes. Facts presented, questions asked, parameters established. The kind of high-stakes problem-solving that had defined my career since West Point, through Afghanistan and Iraq, through the Pentagon's inner chambers and the White House Situation Room. The kind of work my brother could never comprehend from his corporate tower. When the call ended, I looked up to find Richard watching me, a mixture of respect and nostalgia in his eyes. "Just like Kandahar," he said quietly. You always find the path others miss. I managed a small smile. Different stakes. Same principle. Speaking of stakes, Richard said, his tone shifting slightly. Your brother's presentation to the board last week was concerning. I raised an eyebrow but kept typing notes on potential extraction scenarios. My brother's business affairs aren't my concern, Richard. They became mine when he used your name as a reference for his security clearance application. Said you could vouch for his discretion in handling sensitive information. My fingers paused over the tablet. He did what? Listed you as his character reference for a level 2 clearance to work on our government contracts division. I was surprised given what I know about your relationship. I exhaled slowly, returning to my work. I'll deal with Marcus later. Right now, there are sailors who need our focus. Richard nodded and moved to the front seat, giving me space to work. The SUV continued toward the secure facility where I would coordinate the response to the crisis. My mind should have been entirely on the mission, on the lives at stake in waters half a world away. Instead, fragments of dinner conversation kept intruding. Marcus's smug smile, his casual dismissal of my career, his certainty that he understood the world better than I ever could. It was always like this with him. Even when we were children, Marcus needed to be the exceptional one, the special one. When I won the state science fair in 8th grade, he couldn't just congratulate me. He had to mention his soccer championship was more impressive because it was a team achievement. When I was accepted to West Point, he made sure everyone knew his business school acceptance came with a scholarship. Always competing, always positioning, always needing to stand on the higher ground. Colonel Peterson cleared his throat, pulling me from my thought. Ma'am, the advance team has secured the command center. Will arrive in approximately 7 minutes. I nodded, forcing my focus back to the crisis at hand. American lives depended on my clarity, not on family drama. Have General Waters and Admiral Chen been patched in? Yes, ma'am, standing by for your arrival. The next 5 hours passed in a blur of strategic planning, risk assessments and coordination across multiple command structures. By midnight we had a plan approved by the President. By 2 a.m., special operations teams were moving into position. By 4 a.m., all American hostages had been recovered without casualty. Another crisis navigated, another mission successful, all without public knowledge or recognition, exactly as I preferred it. The first hint of dawn was breaking when I finally emerged from the secure facility. My eyes burned from staring at screens, my neck stiff from tension. Colonel Peterson walked beside me, carrying both our briefcases. You should get some rest, ma'am, he said, concern evident in his voice. You've been up for nearly 24 hours. I'll sleep when the after-action reports are complete, I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. Exhaustion was setting in, along with the delayed emotional impact of the Thanksgiving dinner confrontation. A different SUV waited to take me back to my apartment. As I settled into the back seat, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Everyone's safe. Marcus stayed the night. He's still here. Call when you can. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to retreat into the clean, ordered world of military protocol, where rank was earned and respect was given based on demonstrated competence, not family ties. But another part, the part that still remembered building blanket forts with my brother during thunderstorms, couldn't simply walk away. Change of plans, I told the driver. Take me to Silver Springs, Oakview Drive. The neighborhood was quiet when we arrived, most houses still dark in the early morning hours. My parents' home glowed with warm light from the kitchen window. Mom was an early riser, always had been. The smell of coffee would already be filling the house. I instructed the driver to wait and walked up the familiar path to the front door. Before I could knock, it opened. Mom stood there in her robe, gray hair loose around her shoulders, eyes tired but relieved. You're safe, she whispered, pulling me into a fierce hug. Always am, I murmured into her hair, the familiar scent of her shampoo momentarily washing away the weight of command. She led me into the kitchen where Dad sat at the table, newspaper spread before him, reading glasses perched on his nose. He stood when I entered, embracing me with the steady strength that had always been his hallmark. Proud of you, kiddo, he said simply, the words carrying decades of understanding. Dad had served too, retiring as a colonel after 30 years. He knew the weight of the stars on my shoulders better than most. Is he still here? I asked, accepting the mug of coffee Mom pressed into my hand. Dad nodded toward the guest room. Slept in his old room. Been up for about an hour. He's out back. I walked through the house to the back door, pausing to look through the window. Marcus sat on the old wooden swing set Dad had built when we were kids, the one he'd refused to dismantle even when we outgrew it. My brother looked smaller somehow, his expensive suit replaced by borrowed sweatpants and one of Dad's old army t-shirts. His hair, usually perfectly styled, was disheveled. He stared at something in his hands. I stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at my cheeks. The grass crunched with frost beneath my boots. Marcus didn't look up as I approached. Didn't need to. We'd always had that connection, knowing when the other was near without looking. You came back, he said, voice rough with lack of sleep. I always do. He nodded, still looking down. Now I could see what he held, an old photograph, faded with age. The two of us at his high school graduation, his arms slung around my shoulders, both of us grinning like we had the world figured out. Mom said you were handling a crisis. Something in the Middle East. She wouldn't give details. She doesn't know the details. That's how it works. He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and uncertain. All this time I thought you were just hiding, taking the safe route. I thought you were afraid to compete in the real world. I couldn't help the short laugh that escaped me. The real world? Marcus, in the last 24 hours, I've made decisions that determined whether American service members lived or died. What exactly about that isn't real to you? He flinched as if I'd struck him. I didn't know. You never asked. I sat on the other swing, the chains creaking under my weight. You were so busy telling me who I was, you never bothered to find out. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of a neighbor starting their car, the chirp of early morning birds. Marcus twisted the photograph in his hands, creasing it along already worn lines. When did it happen? He finally asked. When did you become a general? I thought you were just some mid-level analyst. I made brigadier general 3 years ago. Before that, I commanded a special operations task force. Before that, I led intelligence operations in Afghanistan. I've never been just anything, Marcus. He shook his head slowly. But you never said anything. At family dinners, holidays, you just let me go on and on about my career, my promotions, my success. Your need to feel superior was never my responsibility to correct. The words hung in the air between us, sharp but honest. Marcus winced. Richard came back last night, he said after a while. After you left, he told us stories about serving under your command, about an operation in Qatar where you evacuated a village before an airstrike, against direct orders. He said you saved over 300 civilians, and when the brass wanted to court-martial you for insubordination, you just presented them with satellite evidence that the target had been misidentified. He said you changed the entire targeting protocol for the region after that. I said nothing. That operation had been classified for years, only recently downgraded to allow limited discussion. He said you were the most brilliant tactical mind he'd ever encountered, and the most humble commander he'd ever served under. Marcus looked up at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I pushed my foot against the ground, setting the swing in gentle motion. Would it have mattered? You decided who I was a long time ago, Mark. A little sister who needed guidance, who couldn't possibly have ambitions or achievements that rivaled yours. Anything I said would have just been noise to you. That's not fair, he protested, but the argument sounded hollow even to his own ears. Isn't it? Last Christmas I mentioned coordinating with the Secretary of State on a classified matter. You laughed and said, I'm sure answering his emails was very important, sis. At Mom's birthday I had to leave early for an emergency briefing with CENTCOM. You told everyone I was probably just using it as an excuse to avoid socializing. I shook my head. You created a narrative about my life that made you comfortable, that kept you in the superior position. The truth wasn't relevant. Marcus stared at the ground, shoulders hunched. I sound like a real asshole. Sometimes you were. A startled laugh escaped him. No sugarcoating, huh? Not my style. I stopped the swing and turned to face him fully. Here's what I don't understand. Why did you need me to be less? What was so threatening about the possibility that I might be succeeding on my own terms? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than I'd heard it in years. Do you remember when we were kids, and Dad would tell his army stories? I nodded. Dad's stories had filled our childhood, tales of camaraderie, courage, and service that had shaped my earliest understanding of purpose. You would sit there with this look on your face, Marcus continued, like you were absorbing every word, like you could already see yourself living that kind of life. I wanted that certainty, that sense of belonging to something bigger. He twisted the photograph again. But I wasn't built for it. I tried ROTC in college, remember? Washed out in the first semester. Couldn't handle the discipline, the structure, the selflessness it required. This was news to me. You never told me you wanted to serve, because it was embarrassing. Perfect little Sophia, following Dad's footsteps, excelling at everything military from day one. And there I was, Marcus the quitter, Marcus the failure. So I found something else, something where aggressive self-interest was an asset, not a liability, where I could win by being exactly the person the military rejected. Understanding dawned, a piece of the puzzle I'd never considered. So every time you dismissed my career, I was really just trying to convince myself I hadn't missed out on something meaningful. He looked up, his expression stripped of its usual confidence. Pretty pathetic, right? The sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the frost-covered lawn. In the kitchen window I could see Mom watching us, worry etched in the lines of her face. 30 years of navigating the complicated waters between her children had left their mark. It's not pathetic to want purpose, I said finally. It's not pathetic to question your choice. What's pathetic is tearing someone else down to feel better about those choices. He nodded, accepting the rebuke without argument. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I've been an ass for a long time. Yes, you have. Another surprised laugh. You're not going to make this easy, are you? Would you respect me if I did? He considered this, then shook his head. Probably not. I stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours in the command center and too little sleep. I need to get some rest. I have to be back at the Pentagon by 4 o'clock, I corrected, remembering his civilian time references. Marcus rose too, the photograph still clutched in his hand. So, Marcus said, attempting normalcy, what can you tell us about the crisis last night? The non-classified version. Obviously, I sipped my coffee considering how much I could share. Americans were in danger. Now they're not. That's it? That's all we get? That's all that matters? Dad chuckled, recognizing the standard military response to civilian curiosity. Marcus looked frustrated but didn't press. Do all your operations end successfully? He asked instead. I set down my mug, the question triggering memories I usually kept carefully compartmentalized. No, not all of them. Something in my tone must have conveyed the weight of those failures, because Marcus's expression sobered. How do you handle that? When things go wrong? It was a surprisingly insightful question from someone who had spent decades avoiding genuine connection with my reality. You learn, you adapt, you honor the sacrifice by doing better next time. I met his eyes across the table. And you never ever forget that your decisions have consequences beyond your own career trajectory. He absorbed this, turning it over like an unfamiliar object. In my world, failure usually just means lost profits or a missed promotion. In mine, it means writing letters to families explaining why their loved ones aren't coming home. Mom set plates of eggs and toast before us, her way of grounding these heavy conversations in the ordinary comfort of shared meals. Dad reached for the salt, then paused, looking between us with the quiet assessment of a man who had spent his life reading situations and people. You two were always different, he said, breaking his customary silence on our conflicts. Different strengths, different paths. Never understood why that had to make you adversaries instead of allies. Marcus stared at his plate. I think that was mostly my doing, Dad. Takes two to maintain a standoff this long, Dad replied evenly, passing the salt to Mom. Question is, what happens now that the truth is on the table? It was a good question, one that would require more than a single breakfast conversation to answer. As I ate, I found myself studying my brother with new eyes, not just seeing the arrogant executive who had belittled my choices for years, but glimpsing again the boy who had once dreamed of following our father's path, who had found himself unsuited to the life I had embraced. who had built his identity around rejecting what he couldn't achieve. Understanding didn't erase the hurt of years of dismissal, but it offered context I had never considered. And in my line of work, context was often the difference between a good decision and a catastrophic one. I should get going, I said finally, pushing back from the table. Thank you for breakfast, Mom. She hugged me tightly. Be safe out there, honey. Always am, I promised, the familiar exchange between us. Dad stood too, walking me to the door with a supportive hand on my shoulder. At the threshold, Marcus appeared, hands shoved awkwardly in the pockets of his borrowed sweatpants. Sophia, he said, hesitating. I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. The words hung between us, simple but profound in their novelty. I nodded, accepting them without comment. It would take more than a single revelation, more than one apology to rebuild what had been broken over decades. But it was a start. Get some sleep, I told him. And Marcus? Don't ever use my name for security clearance again without asking. That's not just unprofessional, it's potentially a federal offense. He paled slightly. Understood. Outside, the SUV waited, Colonel Peterson standing beside it with patient professionalism. As I walked down the path, I heard Marcus call after me. Sophia, I turned. Thank you, he said. For whatever you did last night. For the Americans who are safe because of you. I didn't respond, just offered a small nod before sliding into the vehicle. As we pulled away, I watched my childhood home recede in the window, thinking about identity and perception, about the stories we tell ourselves about others, and the painful recalibration when those stories prove false. Colonel Peterson cleared his throat. Everything all right, ma'am? I turned from the window, already shifting my focus back to the responsibilities awaiting me. Family is complicated, Colonel. Yes, ma'am, he agreed, the simple response containing volumes of understanding. The SUV continued toward my apartment, carrying me back to the world I had chosen. The world I had earned through merit and sacrifice. The world my brother was only now beginning to glimpse. There would be reports to review, decisions to make, crises to manage. The endless, vital work that had defined my life while Marcus built his fortune and his ego in equal measure. But for the first time in years, I drove away from my parents' home, without the familiar weight of being misunderstood, underestimated, dismissed. It wasn't resolution, wasn't healing, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, and in both military strategy and family dynamics, acknowledging reality was always the first step toward meaningful change. 3 days passed before I heard from Marcus again. 3 days of tactical briefings, operational planning, and the careful choreography of international diplomacy that composed my daily reality. The successful hostage extraction had triggered diplomatic ripples across the Middle East, requiring delicate navigation with allies and adversaries alike. I spent more hours in the Pentagon's secure conference rooms than in my own apartment, catching sleep in short bursts between crisis points. By Saturday morning, the situation had stabilized enough for me to take a genuine break. I woke in my own bed for the first time in days, the winter sunlight filtering through blinds I'd forgotten to close. My apartment was quiet, orderly, minimalist, the opposite of my parents' home, with its comfortable clutter and decades of accumulated memories. Some of my colleagues found my living space sterile, but to me it was a sanctuary of calm amid the chaos of global security concerns. I made coffee and was halfway through my first cup when my phone buzzed with a text. Marcus, can we talk? In person. I can come to you. I stared at the message, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to maintain the professional boundary I'd established over years of his dismissal. Another part recognized that meaningful change required opportunity. After a long moment, I replied, Roosevelt Memorial, 2 p.m., East Side. His response came immediately. I'll be there. The memorial was one of my favorite places in D.C., quieter than the more famous monuments, with spaces for contemplation rather than just photo opportunity. I arrived early, taking a seat on a bench, overlooking the tidal basin. The winter air was crisp, the sky clear, the Capitol spread before me in all its complicated glory. I'd spent my career defending this city and what it represented, even when its politics and bureaucracy frustrated me beyond measure. At precisely 2 p.m., Marcus appeared on the path, looking both familiar and strange. Gone was the impeccable power suit, replaced by casual jeans and a simple wool coat. He'd always used clothing as armor, as declaration of status. This version of my brother seemed deliberately stripped of those external markers. He sat beside me without speaking, maintaining a respectful distance. For several minutes we simply watched the tourists wandering among the bronze sculptures, reading Roosevelt's quotes carved in granite. "I looked you up," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Or tried to. There's not much about you online. A few mentions in military press releases, a citation in the Congressional Record from 2018. Nothing that captures," he gestured vaguely, "all of it. That's by design," I replied. "My work requires discretion. Richard told me about Yemen and Syria, said you've been awarded medals that don't officially exist." I turned to look at him directly. Richard has been sharing a lot of classified information with a civilian. Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable. He was making a point, trying to help me understand what an idiot I've been. "And do you understand?" He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm starting to. That's why I wanted to see you. I need to apologize properly, not just in Mom and Dad's kitchen in the middle of a family crisis." I waited, giving him the space to continue. This wasn't a military briefing where I needed to control the flow of information. This was Marcus's moment to speak his truth, and my role was simply to listen. "I've spent my entire adult life competing with a shadow," he said after a moment. "A version of you I created, someone who took the safe path, who avoided risk, who settled for security over ambition. I needed that version of you to exist so I could feel superior about my choices." He shook his head. "The real you, General Sophia Miller, commanding special operations, making life or death decisions, that person terrifies me. Not just because she makes my corporate achievements seem trivial by comparison, but because I've been so spectacularly wrong for so long." A group of schoolchildren passed by, their excited voices carrying in the winter air. Marcus waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. "I used your name on that security clearance application because I wanted the association. Westridge is expanding its government contracts division, and I thought having a connection to someone in the DoD, even a paper pusher, might give me an edge." He winced at his own work. "That's how I thought of you. A paper pusher with useful connections. God, I was an ass." "Yes, you were," I agreed, "but without heat, and that application could have caused serious problems for both of us. Richard made that extremely clear. He's put me on probation at work." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from childhood, a sign of genuine distress. "He said the only reason I'm not fired is because you didn't press the issue." I nodded. After our Thanksgiving confrontation, I'd called Richard and asked him to handle the security clearance matter internally rather than escalating it to an official investigation. Not to protect Marcus, but to avoid the distraction from my actual responsibilities. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Marcus continued, "about measuring success by impact rather than title or salary. It's so foreign to my world, but it's stuck with me. Different values serve different purposes. The military culture works for what we need to accomplish. Corporate culture works for what you need to accomplish. Neither is inherently superior." He looked surprised at my response. "That generous, after how I've treated your career choices." "This isn't about being generous. It's about being accurate." I shifted on the bench, turning to face him more directly. "Marcus, you built a successful career in finance. You've provided well for your family. You've achieved the goals you set for yourself. Those aren't meaningless accomplishments, just because they're different from mine, but they feel meaningless compared to saving lives, protecting the nation." "That's your insecurity talking, not reality," I interrupted. "The problem was never your career path. It was your need to diminish mine to validate yours." He absorbed this, staring out at the tidal basin where a few brave souls were paddling rental boats, despite the cold. "When did you get so wild?" he asked, a hint of his old teasing tone returning. "Somewhere between Afghanistan and having 24-year-old lieutenants look to me for life or death decisions," I replied dryly. "Managing people in combat zones tends to clarify your understanding of human nature." A small smile tugged at his lips. "I bet." The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "Sophia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be brutally honest. That's my natural state. Have I damaged our relationship beyond repair? Is there any way back from years of me?" "Well, me." The question hung between us, weighty and I considered it carefully, the way I would assess a complex tactical situation, examining all variables and potential outcomes. I don't know, I finally said. That depends on whether this revelation about my career is just a shock to your ego, or an actual catalyst for change. If you're just temporarily humbled because your little sister outranks you in a hierarchy you suddenly respect, then no, we can't repair this. But if you're genuinely reassessing how you've approached our relationship and how you measure worth and success, then maybe, he nodded slowly, accepting the unvarnished assessment. That's fair. More than fair, actually. A cold breeze swept across the memorial, causing both of us to hunch slightly against the chill. In the distance, the Washington Monument stood sharp against the winter sky, a reminder of endurance amid changing circumstances. Do you remember Dad's advice when we fought as kids? Marcus asked suddenly. I smiled despite myself. Identify the mission objective before engaging the enemy. Classic Colonel Miller, he agreed. So what's our mission objective here? What does a repaired relationship between us even look like after all this time? It was a good question, one I hadn't fully considered in the whirlwind since Thanksgiving. What did I want from this relationship that had been defined by competition and misunderstanding for so long? I don't need you to suddenly respect my career now that you know my rank, I said carefully. That's just replacing one superficial assessment with another. Then, I need you to see me. Not the version of me you created to feel better about yourself, not the military title that suddenly impresses you, but me, Sophia, your sister who has her own path, her own values, her own definition of success. I met his eyes directly, and I need to do the same for you. See beyond the corporate persona to the brother I used to build blanket forts with during thunderstorms. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this. That's harder than just being impressed by your rank. Most worthwhile things are harder. He laughed softly. Another General Miller axiom. Just experience. I stood, stretching slightly. Walk with me. We moved along the path that circled the memorial, passing through the different rooms dedicated to phases of Roosevelt's life. Other visitors moved around us, most focused on their guidebooks or phones rather than the quiet conversation between siblings, attempting to navigate decades of misunderstanding. I have a question for you, I said as we paused before a bronze statue of Roosevelt in his wheelchair, a representation of vulnerability rarely portrayed in monuments to great leaders. Why finance? Of all the paths you could have taken after washing out of ROTC, why that one? Marcus seemed surprised by the question. No one's ever asked me that before. People usually just assume it was for the money. And was it? Partly, he admitted. But it was more than that. After ROTC, I felt rudder, like I'd failed at the one path our family respected. Dad never said anything, but I felt it. That I'd somehow let the Miller legacy. I frowned. Dad was never disappointed in your career choice. Maybe not explicitly, but there's a difference between acceptance and pride. Marcus shoved his hands deeper into his coat pocket. Anyway, I had this economics professor who saw something in me, said I had a natural talent for understanding systems, for seeing patterns in data that others miss. He said the financial world needed people who could anticipate movements, predict outcomes based on limited information. A rueful smile crossed his face. In some ways, it was the closest civilian equivalent to military strategic thinking, just applied to markets instead of battlefield. This was a perspective on my brother's career I'd never considered, that he might have been drawn to finance not just for status or wealth, but for intellectual challenges that paralleled, in their own way, the strategic thinking our father had valued. Did you ever tell Dad that? I asked. Marcus shook his head. By the time I understood it myself, I'd already established the narrative. Rebellious son rejects military tradition for corporate success. It was easier to maintain that than admit I was still trying to apply the principles he taught us, just in a different arena. We continued walking, circling back toward our starting point. The winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the monument grounds. You know what the hardest part of command is? I asked after a comfortable silence. Making life or death decisions? No, that's the most consequential part, but not the hardest. I paused by a stone engraved with Roosevelt's words about courage and conviction. The hardest part is creating an environment where people can tell you the truth, especially when that truth contradicts your assumptions or challenges your plan. Building relationships where honesty is valued more than comfort or consensus. Marcus considered this. That's not so different from effective leadership in my world, though I can't say I've always prioritized it. Few leaders do. It's easier to surround yourself with people who confirm your existing beliefs. Is this your subtle way of suggesting we've both been guilty of that in our relationship? Creating narratives about each other that went unchallenged for too long. I smiled slightly. Maybe not so subtle. We reached the bench where we'd started, completing our circuit of the memorial. The crowd had thinned as the afternoon light faded, and the temperature dropped further. I have to get back to the Pentagon, I said, checking my watch. Weekend or not, there's still the aftermath of the crisis to manage. Marcus nodded, understanding without resentment for perhaps the first time. Thank you for meeting me, for giving me a chance to apologize properly. This is just a beginning, I reminded him. Real change takes time and consistent effort. I know, he hesitated, then added, Vanessa wants to have you over for dinner sometime, when things settle down for you. She's reassessing her assumptions too. The invitation was unexpected, a tentative olive branch from the sister-in-law who had always treated me with polite condescension. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with the sincerity of the response. As we prepared to part ways, Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box, neatly wrapped in simple blue paper. I brought this for you. It's not much, just something I should have given you a long time ago. I accepted the box with a questioning look. What's the occasion? No occasion, just long overdue recognition. I unwrapped it carefully to find a small wooden frame containing a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, West Point Cadet Awarded Prestigious Marshall Scholarship. Below it was a photo of me at 20, solemn in uniform, accepting the honor. I remembered the day clearly, the ceremony, the pride, the sense of purpose. What I didn't remember was this article ever being published. Where did you get this? I asked, genuinely puzzled. I saved it, Marcus admitted. When it came out in the university paper, I was a sophomore when you won. I cut it out, and kept it. Even while I was telling everyone how conventional and unambitious your path was. He looked embarrassed. I was proud of you even when I couldn't admit it to myself, even when I was working so hard to prove I didn't need to follow in your footsteps. The admission hit me with unexpected force. The idea that somewhere beneath the decades of dismissal and competition, my brother had harbored a quiet pride in my achievement, that he had preserved this moment even while publicly diminishing similar accomplishments. Thank you, I said simply, carefully returning the framed article to its box. This means more than you know. We parted with an awkward hug, both of us still navigating the new territory of genuine connection after years of carefully maintained distance. As I watched him walk toward the parking area, I felt a curious mixture of emotions, cautious hope, lingering wariness, something else I hadn't expected, a sense of possibility that our relationship might evolve into something neither of us had experienced before. Not a return to childhood closeness, but something more mature and honest, a relationship between adults who saw each other clearly, with all our complexities and contradictions. My secure phone buzzed as I reached my car. Colonel Peterson's name flashed on the screen. Back to reality. Back to the responsibilities that defined my days and occasionally my nights. I answered, already shifting mental gears from sister to general. Miller, I said crisply. Ma'am, sorry to interrupt your weekend. The secretary has called an emergency meeting. Situation developing in the Baltics. I'm on my way. Have the briefing materials ready. I ended the call and started the engine, the memorial already receding in my rearview mirror. The contrast wasn't lost on me. From a deeply personal conversation about family dynamics, to international security concerns in the span of seconds. This was my life. These rapid transitions between worlds, these parallel realities of personal and professional that rarely intersected. For years I had kept them deliberately separate, partly due to security considerations, partly due to Marcus's inability to see beyond his preconception. Now, for the first time, those walls had begun to crack, not crumbling entirely. That would neither be possible nor desirable given the nature of my work, but perhaps becoming more permeable, allowing some light to pass between these compartmentalized aspects of my existence. As I navigated the Washington traffic toward the Pentagon, I found myself wondering what our parents would make of this tentative reconciliation. Dad, with his tactical mind, would probably say we had finally identified the correct mission objective. Mom, with her emotional intelligence, would simply be relieved that her children were learning to see each other as allies rather than adversaries. The Pentagon loomed ahead, massive and imposing against the darkening sky. I passed through security checkpoints with practiced efficiency, my mind already turning toward the Baltic situation, assessing potential scenarios, preparing to make decisions that would have far-reaching consequences. Colonel Peterson met me at the elevator, tablet in hand, already briefing me on the developing crisis. The transition was complete, General Miller fully present, Sister Sophia temporarily set aside, but as we walked toward the secure conference room where other military leaders waited, I felt the weight of the small box in my bag, a tangible reminder that even generals have histories, have relationships, have identities beyond their rank and responsibility. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Colonel Peterson asked, noticing my momentary distraction. I nodded, refocusing on the mission at hand. "Yes, Colonel. Everything's fine." And for the first time in a very long while, I believed it might actually be true. The Baltic situation consumed the next 72 hours, Russian naval movements threatening NATO allies, intelligence suggesting possible incursions into contested waters, diplomatic channels heating up with accusations. I coordinated with European Command, developed contingency plans, briefed the Joint Chiefs, and managed the delicate balance of showing strength without escalation. By Wednesday morning, the immediate crisis had been averted through a combination of strategic military positioning and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. I emerged from the final briefing exhausted but satisfied, having helped navigate yet another dangerous international moment without a shot being fired. As I walked toward my office, intending to gather my things before heading home for some much-needed rest, my phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source, Richard Harrington. "Need to speak with you regarding Marcus. Not urgent, but important. Available for coffee." I frowned slightly, wondering what new complication had arisen. After a moment's consideration, I responded, "Pentagon Cafe, 30 minutes." Richard was already waiting when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the table before him. He rose when he saw me, a gesture of respect that seemed both professional and personal. "General," he greeted me, then softened to, "Sophia, thank you for making time. I know you've been handling the Baltic situation." I sat across from him, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "What's this about Marcus? Has he created another security issue?" "Quite the opposite, actually." Richard seemed almost amused. "He came to me on Monday with a proposal for restructuring our government contracts division. Complete overhaul of how we handle security protocols, transparency measures, ethical guidelines for dealing with classified information." He took a sip of his coffee. "It's remarkably thorough and surprisingly principled." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "That doesn't sound like the Marcus I know. That's why I wanted to speak with you. He's different since Thanksgiving." "Focused, yes, but not in his usual aggressive way. More purposeful." Richard studied me over the rim of his cup. "Whatever happened between you two seems to have triggered something of a transformation." I considered this information, trying to reconcile it with the brother I'd known for decades. "People don't change overnight." "No," Richard agreed, "but sometimes they find clarity overnight. The actual change takes longer." He set down his cup. "I served under you long enough to know you don't trust easy conversions. Neither do I, but I thought you should know. He's trying, really trying." The cafe buzzed with activity around us, military personnel grabbing quick meals, civilian contractors discussing projects, the everyday business of national defense continuing regardless of personal dramas or international crises. "Why tell me this?" I asked finally. "This seems like a professional matter between you and him." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Because I remember Cotter Gen. I remember how you fought for your team, how you saw potential in people that others had written off. You gave second chances when they were earned, not when they were merely requested." He paused. "Marcus isn't one of your lieutenants. He's your brother. But I thought you deserved to know that your conversation with him seems to have had a profound impact." I nodded, absorbing this unexpected perspective. "Thank you for telling me. There's one more thing." Richard hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "The proposal he submitted. It's good. Very good. innovative approaches to compliance that could actually enhance security while streamlining operations, the kind of thinking that could genuinely improve how private sector entities handle classified government work. And, I prompted, sensing there was more, and he's requested permission to consult with experts at the Pentagon to refine the protocols. Not you specifically, he was clear about maintaining appropriate boundaries, but he wants to learn from the people who understand these risks best. Richard looked at me directly. I'm inclined to approve it, but I wanted your take first. The request presented an interesting dilemma. On one hand, better security protocols for defense contractors were undeniably in the national interest. On the other, allowing Marcus access to Pentagon experts so soon after his security clearance misstep could appear as preferential treatment. Have him submit the proposal through proper channels, I said after careful consideration. If it passes initial review on its merits, I won't object to appropriate consultation, but I won't intervene either way. Richard nodded, seeming to have expected this response. Fair enough. I'll have him proceed through standard protocols. He finished his coffee and stood. For what it's worth, Sophia, I think your brother might finally be finding his own way to serve. The observation stayed with me as I gathered my belongings and headed home for some much-needed rest. The idea that Marcus, competitive, status-driven Marcus, might be channeling his ambition towards something with genuine public value seemed almost too convenient a narrative. Yet Richard was a shrewd judge of character, not given to sentimentality or easy optimism. As I drove through the evening traffic, I found myself wondering if perhaps I had been as guilty as Marcus of clinging to a fixed narrative, seeing him only as the dismissive, self-absorbed brother who needed to diminish my choices to validate his own. Had I missed signs of potential growth because they didn't fit the story I'd constructed? The question followed me home, lingered as I showered away the exhaustion of 3 days of crisis management, remained as I finally sank into my own bed for uninterrupted sleep. The last thought before unconsciousness claimed me was a memory. Marcus at 12 standing up to neighborhood bullies who had mocked my science project, fiercely protective and proud of his brainiac sister. Perhaps that boy wasn't entirely gone, just buried beneath years of insecurity and misdirected ambition. Perhaps we were both finally ready to see beyond the stories we had written for each other, to discover who we might actually be. 2 months passed with surprising swiftness. Winter released its grip on Washington, giving way to the first tentative signs of spring. Cherry blossoms prepared for their annual display, tourists began arriving in greater number, and the rhythm of the capital continued its eternal cycle of crisis and calm, political maneuvering, and public service. My professional responsibilities remained as demanding as ever. A hostage situation in North Africa, escalating tensions in the South China Sea, coordination with NATO allies on emerging cyber threats. The nature of global security meant there was never truly a quiet period, just different varieties of challenges requiring different approaches. Through it all, something unexpected was happening in my personal life, a gradual, cautious reconnection with my brother. It began with text messages, brief at first, then longer. Updates on his security protocol project, which had indeed been approved through proper channels. Questions about our parents. Occasional links to articles he thought might interest me. I responded when time allowed, maintaining appropriate boundaries about my work while slowly letting him see more of the person behind the reins. We met for coffee twice, once at a quiet cafe near the mall, once at our parents' house during a Sunday visit. The conversations were sometimes awkward, sometimes surprisingly easy, but always more honest than they had been in decades. Neither of us mentioned Thanksgiving directly, but its revelations hovered in the background, the catalyst for this careful rebuilding. Then came the invitation I hadn't expected. A formal envelope arrived at my apartment, cream-colored cardstock with embossed lettering. Westridge Financial cordially invites you to the launch of our new Secure Government Services Division, Friday, April 12, 7 p.m. National Portrait Gallery, Kagod Courtyard. A handwritten note was paper-clipped to the invitation. Your insights helped shape this, even if indirectly. I'd be honored if you could attend. Marcus. I studied the invitation for a long moment, weighing the professional and personal implications. Attending a corporate event for a defense contractor could raise questions about potential conflicts of interest, even with no direct involvement in procurement decisions. Yet this was clearly important to Marcus. a gesture of inclusion in his professional world after I had inadvertently revealed mine. After careful consideration, I sent a text. I'll be there, but keeping a low profile. No introductions as General Miller. Just your sister. His response came quickly. Understood and appreciated. Thank you. The evening of the event arrived with cherry blossoms at their peak, the city transformed by their delicate beauty. I chose my attire carefully. A navy blue dress, elegant but understated, with a simple silver pendant that had been our mother's, professional enough for the setting, but deliberately civilian. No uniform, no visible markers of my rank or position. The National Portrait Gallery's Kagod courtyard had been transformed for the occasion. The soaring glass ceiling, letting in the last light of day while discreet lighting created an atmosphere of refined celebration below. Corporate executives mingled with government officials, everyone performing the careful dance of public-private partnership that defined so much of Washington's business. I entered quietly, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, scanning the room with the habitual situational awareness that never quite turned off, even in civilian settings. Several Pentagon officials were present, none from my direct chain of command, a few congressional staffers, a handful of State Department representatives. Standard attendance for this type of corporate launch. I turned to find Marcus behind me, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, but with something different in his demeanor, a groundedness that hadn't been there before, a confidence that seemed less performative and more authentic. I said I would, I replied, accepting his brief, somewhat awkward hug. Thank you. I know this isn't really your scene. I smiled slightly. I've attended more formal functions than you might imagine. Diplomacy happens at receptions as often as in conference rooms. He nodded, acknowledging this glimpse into my professional reality. Still, I appreciate you making the time, especially since... He glanced around, lowering his voice. I know you've been dealing with the situation in Tunisia. The reference to a classified operation took me by surprise. I kept my expression neutral, but my eyes asked the question. Dad mentioned you'd canceled dinner with them last week because of developments in North Africa, Marcus explained quickly. I didn't press for details, just put it together with what's in the news. I relaxed slightly, relieved he wasn't referencing classified information. Sometimes a canceled dinner is just a canceled dinner, he smiled, recognizing the deflection. Of course, would you like a tour? The formal presentations won't start for another 30 minutes. I nodded, and he led me through the courtyard, pointing out key figures in attendance, explaining the significance of various guests without the boasting that would have characterized such conversations in the past. As we walked, I noticed people's reactions to him, respectful attention, genuine engagement, not just the deference to power I had expected. You seem different here, I observed during a quiet moment. More authentic, he suggested. I'm trying to be. After Thanksgiving, I did a lot of thinking about how I've approached leadership, relationships, my whole professional identity really. He gestured toward a quiet corner where we could speak more privately. I realized I've been playing a character for most of my career. Corporate Marcus, the ruthless achiever, the guy who values profit and power above all else, and that's changed. I'm letting more of real Marcus show up at work. The guy who actually cares about doing things right, not just doing them profitably. He shrugged, a hint of self-consciousness in the gesture. Turns out people respond better to authentic leadership than to calculated performance. Who knew? The observation was delivered lightly, but I could sense the deeper realization behind it, a fundamental shift in how he viewed his professional identity and purpose. Richard says your security protocol project has gained significant traction, I offered, giving him space to elaborate. His eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. It's evolved into something much bigger than I initially envisioned. We're creating a whole new framework for how private sector partners handle classified information, not just checking compliance boxes, but fundamentally rethinking the approach. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I discovered I actually care about this, about getting it right, about creating systems that protect national security while enabling necessary partnerships. Before I could respond, Richard Harrington appeared at Marcus's elbow. Sorry to interrupt, but the secretary has arrived. We should begin the presentation soon. Marcus nodded. I'll be right there. As Richard stepped away, he turned back to me. Would you mind staying toward the back during the formal part? Not because I'm not proud to have you here, because tonight, should be about the work, not about your connection to a general. I finished for him. I understand completely. That's why I came as Sophia, not as General Miller. Gratitude flashed across his face. Thank you. I found a spot near one of the courtyard's elegant columns, as the lights dimmed slightly and attention focused on a small stage at the far end. Richard spoke first, outlining Westridge's commitment to national security partnership. Then came a government representative, I recognized from the Defense Contract Management Agency, offering measured praise for the company's innovative approach to security protocol. Finally, Marcus took the stage. Gone was the brash, slightly aggressive demeanor I associated with his corporate persona. In its place was something more measured, more purposeful. He spoke about responsibility, the responsibility of private sector partners to uphold the highest standards when entrusted with sensitive information, about integrity as a non-negotiable foundation for any meaningful security system, about the privilege of supporting those who served the nation directly. True security isn't achieved through complicated systems or rigid protocols alone, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtyard. It comes from a culture of respect for the information we handle and what it represents, the safety of our nation and those who defend it. I watched my brother with a strange mixture of pride and wonderment. The words themselves were impressive enough, but it was the authenticity behind them that struck me most forcefully. This wasn't Marcus performing leadership, this was Marcus actually leading, guided by principles he genuinely appeared to believe. When the presentations concluded and the event transitioned back to mingling, I remained in my corner observing rather than participating. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but without the performative charm that had once characterized his professional interactions. He listened more than he spoke, engaged rather than impressed, connected rather than commanded. He's quite transformed, isn't he? I turned to find Richard beside me, 2 glasses of sparkling water in hand. He offered one to me, which I accepted with a nod of thanks. I'm still evaluating the evidence, I replied, military caution preventing me from drawing premature conclusions. Richard smiled. Spoken like a true strategic commander, but in this case, I think the evidence is compelling. He gestured toward Marcus, now deep in conversation with the DCMA representative. 6 months ago, that conversation would have been all about what Westridge could get from the government. Now he's focused on what his team can contribute to national security infrastructure. I sipped my water, neither confirming nor denying the assessment. People can surprise you. Indeed they can. Richard's gaze was thoughtful. You know, after I left active service, I struggled to find purpose in corporate work. The stakes seemed so much lower, the mission so much less clear. It took years to realize that I could bring the same values, service, integrity, mission focus to this arena. And you think that's what's happening with Marcus? I think your brother is finally finding his way to serve something larger than his own ambition. Richard glanced at me. Isn't that what the Miller family does, in one form or another? The observation landed with unexpected impact. The idea that perhaps Marcus's transformation wasn't a repudiation of his past self, but a reclamation of something deep, a connection to values that had shaped our family across generations. Different expressions of the same underlying commitment to service and purpose. Before I could respond, my secure phone vibrated in my clutch. A quick glance showed Colonel Peterson's number, never a good sign during evening hours. Excuse me, I said to Richard. I need to take this. I moved to a quieter corner of the courtyard, finding a small alcove with relative privacy. Miller, I answered crisply. Ma'am, sorry to interrupt your evening. We have a situation developing in the Philippines. PCPOM is requesting your immediate input on response options. Secure transport is en route to your location. Understood. I'll be outside in 5 minutes. I ended the call and took a moment to center myself, already shifting mental gears from sister to general, from personal to professional. As I emerged from the alcove, I found Marcus waiting nearby, concern evident in his expression. You have to go, he said. Not a question but a statement of understanding. I nodded. Duty call. Is it serious? He asked, then quickly added. Don't answer that. I know you can't discuss it. I need to head outside. There's a car coming. He nodded, walking with me toward the exit, without pressing for details I couldn't share. As we reached the main doors, he paused. Thank you for coming tonight. It meant more than you know. The presentation was excellent, I said honestly. You've done important work with this initiative. A small smile crossed his face. High praise from General Miller. From your sister, I corrected gently. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a moment of genuine connection. Even better. Outside, a black SUV was already pulling up to the curb, Colonel Peterson visible in the passenger seat. Marcus spotted it immediately, recognizing the implications without needing explanation. Go, he said simply. Do what you do best. I touched his arm briefly, a gesture of both farewell and newfound respect. You too. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of strategic planning, secure video conferences, and the careful orchestration of military assets across the Pacific region. A terrorist group had taken hostages at a facility with American personnel, requiring coordinated response with Philippine authorities and careful navigation of complex diplomatic constraints. By the time the situation stabilized, hostages secured, threats neutralized, international relations maintained, I had been awake for nearly 30 hours straight. I debriefed the Secretary of Defense, coordinated with State Department officials on the public messaging, and finally, as the adrenaline began to subside, allowed Colonel Peterson to drive me home for some much-needed rest. As we pulled up to my apartment building, he handed me a folded note. This was delivered to the Pentagon for you, ma'am. Security cleared it. I unfolded the heavy cardstock to find Marcus's distinctive handwriting. Whatever you're handling, I know you're doing it with the same excellence and integrity you bring to everything. When the crisis passes, let me know you're safe. Proud to be your brother. Simple message, supportive without being intrusive, acknowledging my responsibilities without demanding details, represented a level of understanding that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. I refolded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Thank you, Colonel. Please inform the command team I'll be back on duty at 0800 tomorrow. Yes, and if I may say so, excellent work on the Philippines situation. Your contingency planning made all the difference. I nodded, accepting the professional assessment without comment. Get some rest yourself, Colonel. We all need clear heads for the after-action review tomorrow. Inside my apartment, I moved through the familiar routine of post-crisis decompression, shower, comfortable clothes, a small meal despite lack of appetite, a systematic mental review of decisions made and their outcome. The process was well established, a necessary transition from the intensity of command to the possibility of rest. As I finally settled onto my couch, I retrieved my personal phone and found 3 missed texts from Marcus, spread across the hours of the crisis. Saw the news about the Philippines. Not assuming you're involved, but if you are, stay safe. Mom's worried, but I told her you're the most capable person either of us knows. No need to respond until you can. Just know your family's thinking of you. The messages were striking in their restraint. No demands for information, no complaints about my sudden departure from his event. Just simple expressions of support and confidence. I typed a brief response. All resolved. Everyone safe. Thank you for understanding. His reply came almost immediately, suggesting he'd been keeping his phone close despite the late hour. Never doubted you for a second, General. Get some rest. And then, a moment later, proud of you, sis. Always have been. Even when I was too insecure to show it. I stared at the message, feeling something shift and settle within me. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet recognition that perhaps real change was possible, that relationships could evolve beyond their established patterns, if both parties were willing to see each other anew. 3 weeks later, our parents hosted a small dinner to celebrate Dad's birthday. The gathering was intimate, just the 4 of us, plus Vanessa in the familiar comfort of the house where Marcus and I had grown up. Mom had prepared all of Dad's favorites, the dining room table set with the good china reserved for special occasions. I arrived last, coming directly from the Pentagon after a day of routine briefings and operational planning. As I walked through the front door, the scene that greeted me was both familiar and strangely new. Mom in the kitchen, Dad reading in his favorite chair, Vanessa setting the table, and Marcus, not holding court or dominating the conversation, but helping Mom with dinner preparations, listening attentively as she gave instructions about her precisely timed cooking routine. There she is, Dad called, setting aside his book with a warm smile. The final Miller has arrived. I hugged him, inhaling the familiar scent of his aftershave, feeling the sturdy strength that had always represented security in my childhood. Happy birthday, Dad. Thank you, kid. Just glad to have all of us together. doesn't happen nearly enough. In the kitchen, Marcus looked up from the salad he was assembling. Hey sis. Good day. Routine, I replied. The standard response for questions about my work in mixed company. Need another pair of hands in there? Actually, yes. Mom called. Can you check the roast? Marcus has many talents, but judging meat temperature isn't one of them. I moved into the kitchen, washing my hands at the sink before checking the roast. Perfectly done. As moms always. Marcus worked beside me, chopping vegetables with surprising competence. When did you learn your way around a kitchen? I asked quietly, genuinely curious. He smiled, a hint of self-deprecation in the expression. Vanessa and I have been taking cooking classes, part of my effort to be less of a workaholic and more of an actual human being. He gestured with the knife toward the living room, where Vanessa chatted easily with Dad. We're trying to reprioritize, build a life that's about more than just career advancement and status symbols. The admission was delivered simply without the performative self-improvement language I might have expected. Just a quiet acknowledgement of change and progress. Dinner was served with Dad at the head of the table, Mom at the foot, Marcus and Vanessa on one side, me on the other, the same arrangement we had maintained since childhood. Yet the dynamic around the table felt subtly different. Marcus didn't dominate the conversation, didn't turn every topic toward his achievements. Instead, he asked questions, listened to responses, contributed without needing to center himself. How's the security protocol implementation going? I asked during a lull in the conversation, offering an opening to discuss his work without putting him on the spot. Challenging but rewarding, he replied, his enthusiasm evident but contained. We're in the implementation phase now, working with 3 government agencies to pilot the new framework. He glanced at Vanessa, including her in the moment. It's actually the most meaningful project I've worked on in my entire career. He's become quite the security evangelist, Vanessa added, affection evident in her tone. I barely recognize this version of my husband, who comes home talking about integrity systems and ethical frameworks, instead of profit margin. Still talk about those too, Marcus acknowledged with a small smile. But they're not the only metric that matters anymore. Dad raised his glass in a subtle toast. Good to hear. Success is hollow if it doesn't serve something beyond itself. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Mom sharing news about community projects, Dad discussing a veterans support group he had recently joined, Vanessa describing a mentorship program she had initiated for young women in finance. Throughout it all, I observed the subtle but significant shifts in family dynamics. More listening, more genuine interest, less positioning and competition. After dinner, as Mom and Vanessa cleared the dishes, refusing offers of help in the time-honored tradition of wanting things done their way, Marcus suggested a short walk. Dad declined, preferring to rest in his favorite chair, leaving just the 2 of us to step out into the mild spring evening. We walked in comfortable silence down the familiar street, past houses we had known since childhood, beneath trees that had grown alongside us. The neighborhood had changed over the decades, new families moving in, houses renovated, gardens reimagined, yet it retained the essential character that had shaped our earliest understandings of the world. Remember when we used to race bikes down this hill? Marcus asked as we approached a gentle slope. You were fearless even back then. I smiled at the memory. You let me win, sometimes. Only sometimes, he corrected with a grin. You legitimately beat me plenty. We reached the small park at the end of the block, a simple playground where we had spent countless childhood hours. By unspoken agreement, we sat on the swings, 2 small seats accommodating adult bodies awkwardly but serviceably. I've been thinking a lot about that Thanksgiving, Marcus said after a comfortable silence, about how I saw you, or rather how I refused to see you, for so many years. I pushed slightly with my foot, setting the swing in gentle motion. What conclusions have you reached? That I was looking for validation in all the wrong places, measuring success by all the wrong metrics. He looked up at the darkening sky, stars just beginning to appear. When Richard called you general, it wasn't just the surprise of your rank that shook me. It was the realization that you'd built something meaningful while I'd been chasing emptier forms of achievement. Your achievements aren't empty, I countered. You've built a successful career, provided well for your family. Those things matter. They do, he agreed. But they're not enough on their own. Not enough to build a life around. He glanced at me. I think I always knew that, deep down, It's why I resented your choices so much, because some part of me recognized the substance in them, the purpose I was missing. I considered his words, appreciating the self-awareness they represented. And now I'm trying to find my own version of purpose, not copying yours. I've finally accepted that we're different people with different strengths, but finding ways to make my work matter beyond just financial metrics. He smiled slightly. Turns out corporate America could use a few more people who think like military strategists, focused on mission, integrity, long-term security rather than just quarterly profit. The simple articulation of his evolution struck me as remarkably mature. Not a dramatic reinvention, but a thoughtful integration of new values with existing strengths, a recalibration rather than a rejection of his past self. I'm proud of you, Marcus, I said quietly, not because you're finally seeing the value in my choices, but because you're finding your own authentic path. He looked surprised, then pleased at the unexpected affirmation. That means more coming from you than you probably realize. We swung gently for a few more minutes, comfortable in the shared silence, before turning back toward the house. As we approached, I could see our parents through the front window, Dad now dozing in his chair, Mom reading beside him, Vanessa sorting through old photo albums on the floor. A tableau of family connection that had once felt strained by unspoken tensions, now restored to something more genuine. You know what I've realized, Marcus said as we paused on the front walk. We're more similar than different, you and I. Just took me way too long to see it. I raised an eyebrow, curious about this assessment. We're both strategists, he explained, both focused on achieving objectives, protecting what matters, building systems that work. You just chose to apply those talents to national security while I applied mine to financial market, he shrugged. Different arenas, same core approach. The observation was surprisingly insightful. A recognition of shared family traits expressed through different vehicles, different contexts, different values. Not a competition, but a variation on shared themes. Maybe you're right, I acknowledged. Though I still can't read a profit and loss statement to save my life, he laughed, the sound genuine and warm in the evening air. And I still can't tell north from south without Google Maps. Guess we each have our specialties. As we rejoined our family I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past few months, from the painful confrontation of Thanksgiving, to this moment of genuine connection and mutual respect. Not a fairy tale transformation, not a complete resolution of decades of complex dynamics, but a meaningful evolution towards something healthier, more honest, more supportive. My brother had finally seen me clearly, not as a foil for his own narrative, but as a person with my own path, my own purpose, my own definition of success. And perhaps more importantly, I had finally seen him beyond the caricature I had constructed, recognizing the potential for growth, the capacity for change, the authentic desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. Different paths, different expressions, but perhaps, at the core, the same fundamental Miller family values: service, integrity, purpose, manifesting in ways as unique as we were. Not a competition after all, but a complement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.